Our speaker today is Nader Hashemi. He is Associate Professor at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He's been visiting professor at the University of California in Los Angeles. He's been an Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Northwestern University. His titles go on, but he is quickly becoming a leading expert on the Middle East. And I'm without, you want me to say anything else about you? More I guess what I would like to say is we're very, very welcome to have you with us for a program to speak on Hamas and its meaning and implications for us. Welcome, Nader, please.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm honored by the invitation. I have to admit that I was deeply torn as to whether I should accept this invitation. I struggled very hard for accepting, and the reason for that should all be obvious to anyone who lives here in the United States. Today, of course, is the final of the US Open, and I wanted to stay home and watch Roger Federer win his next Grand Slam tournament, but I received this invitation, so
It's raining in New York.
It's raining in New York, so I might be able to catch the latter parts of the game after this, if you keep your questions short. No, but this topic is extremely important, and actually I'm glad that we are able to have a conversation about a very emotionally charged topic that is poorly understood, particularly in this country. And so I'm happy to share with you some observations on the question of Hamas. I tentatively titled my presentation, Hamas, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And of course, the view of Hamas, this is a topic that is not a neutral topic. You are all instinctively and inherently aware of the subject, and everyone comes into the conversation with a preconceived notion of what this group is all about and how it is perceived. Of course, the official position of Hamas with respect to the United States is that it is a terrorist organization. It is a deeply socially conservative organization. It is considered to be an obstacle to peace in the Middle East, and the dominant view, at least among our elected officials, is that the quicker that Hamas can be crushed or removed from the political scene in Israel-Palestine, the better the prospects for peace. That's the dominant view, and it's a view that I disagree with. I think to sort of leave it at that and to assume that the narrative and the stories and the arguments that we've been told by our elected officials is all that there is that we need to know about the topic. Let's go home and hope perhaps that the remnants of the Palestine Liberation Organization or secular Palestinian nationalism or the so-called Palestine Authority can reconstitute the support of most Palestinians, and that will be a way forward. I think is a intellectually and ideologically tempting way to view this conflict and this topic, but I think at the end of the day it's fundamentally misleading, and I want to tell you why. So let's begin with just some basic terms and concepts. Hamas is an acronym of the Arabic phrase Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, which translates as Islamic Resistance Movement. In Arabic, the word Hamas is sometimes translated as enthusiasm or zeal, and Hamas supporters interpret the name as strength or bravery. It comprises three interrelated wings: a social welfare dimension, a political wing, which is responsible for social, administrative, political, and propaganda activities, and then a military wing, which is engaged in covert acts of armed resistance and, yes, terrorism against Israel. It has a consultative assembly, what's called a Majlis al-Shura, a consultative assembly that does actually reach deep into Palestinian society and represent different Palestinian regions, factions, both in historic Palestine, in the occupied territories, and throughout the Middle East. So there is an attempt to represent public opinion that is connected to the worldview of Hamas in the decision-making process of this organization. There is a higher decision-making body, a political bureau. It was formerly based in Damascus prior to the Syrian civil war, and now it was in Cairo for a while, and now it is sort of back in Gaza, and of course under pressure and under sort of constraints based on regional developments that have taken over the Middle East since the Arab Spring. Now, of course, one of the most important and most often talked about aspects of Hamas that we are told embodies the entire organization and nothing more is its military, known as the Issa-Din al-Qassam Brigades, founded in 1992, named after a very prominent Palestinian nationalist who resisted the British mandate, Sheikh Issa-Din al-Qassam. The numbers are unknown in terms of how many active members they have. Some figures say there's about 10,000 operatives that have varying degrees of skill and professionalism. They are an integral part of the Hamas movement, but they also operate and decide on when to attack, when to plan operations independently of the political organization. Most scholars of Hamas acknowledge, however, that Hamas's internal discipline does allow it to provide significant constraints, if it wants to, on the activities of the military wing of its organization, the Qassam Brigades. And if you want to think of an analogy between Hamas's political wing and its military wing, think of the relationship between Sinn Féin and the IRA, a political and military sort of dimensions of the same movement, motivated by similar grievances against more stronger political powers that they are in contest with. There's also the often neglected and much important in terms of explaining why Hamas has popularity, or at least sympathy, among Palestinians. It's social welfare dimension. Hamas has a social welfare wing that provides social services to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and when it's allowed to operate in the West Bank, including the running of relief programs, funding of schools, orphanages, mosques, healthcare clinics, soup kitchens, sports leagues, etc. In particular, Hamas has funded health services where people could receive inexpensive medical treatment. Hamas has contributed to basically a non-existent or very broken health sector within the occupied territories. Sometimes Hamas's participation in the health sector of Palestinian society is criticized because it is viewed that the people who get preferential treatment in their hospitals are those people who are closer to the organization, and those who are not closer to the organization receive less financial support, both in terms of medical care and financial assistance. I think that's accurate. Hamas has funded education. It's built Islamic charities, libraries, books, bookstores, mosques, etc. So it's deeply involved in the social fabric of Palestinian society. To think that you can somehow, knock off the head of the organization or its political wing, and that's it, that they are simply this sort of cancerous growth, that if we can sort of, bomb them into submission, then that's the end of the story, is wishful thinking. It's because they are deeply connected, for better or for worse, with Palestinian society, and they do play a particularly important role in social welfare. Now, in terms of trying to understand the history of the organization, its background, one has to sort of look at broader political, social, and intellectual trends that have been percolating in the Arab Islamic world for much of the 20th century, particularly as we get into the latter parts of the 20th century, and I'm talking about 1967 onwards. Up until, I would say, 1967, if one had to choose an arbitrary year, the dominant ideological and political framework of activism, of political mobilization, was various forms of secular Arabic nationalism. In the case of the Palestinians, it was the PLO. There were very small minority Islamic currents of opinion that were percolating in the Arab world, largely connected to and affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood movement located in Egypt, and with various chapters around the Middle East. And given the fact that the Gaza Strip was under Egyptian occupation until 1967, there was a chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Gaza Strip that emerges and is around and active in 1967 when Israel enters the equation and becomes the dominant occupying force. But up until 1967 and into the 1970s, and really into most of the 1980s, the Muslim Brotherhood chapter in the Gaza Strip, and to the extent that it existed in the West Bank, was not only a minority movement. The dominant sort of grouping was secular Palestinian nationalism, identified and connected to the PLO, but it was also deeply apolitical. The political Islamists, so to speak, weren't really political until the late 1980s. And the transformation that takes place in the Palestinian body politic, the switch and the emergence of a political Islamist current, largely takes place for many of the same reasons that it takes place in other Arabic and Muslim majority countries in the Middle East. There is a perceived failure of secular Arab nationalism throughout the region post-1967. That's the dominant sort of current that takes over, and people start to look for other ideological movements, political projects, reasons for organizing and mobilizing that can provide hope and optimism for a better future. So that trend is taking place across the Arab and Islamic world. It takes place also in the case of the Palestinians, primarily in Gaza. But there's one critical difference between the upsurge of political Islamist consciousness among the Palestinians in the 1970s and 1980s that distinguishes it from other parts of the Arab and Islamic world, and that is that the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, in contrast to other parts of the Arab Islamic world, are under Israeli occupation. There is an attempt to subjugate, control, manipulate, oppress, and deny them their basic rights to self-determination, and there is a conflict that emerges. And of course, the first time you begin to hear or see any reference to this organization known as Hamas that becomes visible, organized, handing out leaflets, trying to get involved in Palestinian politics, takes place in the late 1980s, around 1987, and it coincides with the first Palestinian Intifada, which, if you are interested in the topic of Israel-Palestine, in particular in the struggle for Palestinian rights, you should know that that's when the first Palestinian uprising takes place against Israeli occupation, and in the Gaza Strip, and then later on in the West Bank, you have this new movement that very much claiming to come from the same ideological and political framework as the Muslim Brotherhood movements in other parts of the Arab world, asserts itself, becomes part of the attempt to resist and roll back and fight the Israeli occupation. And from then on, it becomes increasingly a dominant player in Palestinian politics. And now I think it has sunk such deep roots that there is no way of conceiving of a future political program for the Palestinians that represents Palestinian public opinion if you try to exclude Hamas from the equation. They do represent, for better or for worse, a significant portion of Palestinian public opinion. We can debate on how much or how little, but they are part of that equation. So in the late 1980s, starting in around 1989, we begin to see the first military clashes and acts of what Israel calls acts of terrorism, what Palestinians call acts of resistance against Israeli soldiers in 1989 that Hamas lays claim for, and they start to target both Israeli occupation forces and then in the 1990s, increasingly targeting Israeli civilian targets in Israel proper through these wave of suicide attacks that really start to increase as we get throughout the 1990s, particularly after the 1994 massacre by Baruch Goldstein of 30 Muslim civilians in Hebron. Hamas claims that that was a turning point for them, and they engage in these waves of horrific suicide attacks that increase. The first Intifada ends by around 1992, 1993. There's a period of I guess some people thought there was a period of hope because you have the Oslo Accords coming in, but then you have the second Intifada as we get into the 2000s. The second Intifada begins approximately in the year September 2000, and you have another wave of increasing acts of violence on both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, and Hamas is the leading sort of proponent of attacks against both Israeli soldiers, officials, and Israeli civilians. And they take responsibility for it, and they brag about it, and they believe that these are legitimate targets of attack that can be justified in the context of a struggle for national liberation. And if you look at the figures during the second Intifada, the military and civilian tolls are estimated that during the second Intifada, approximately 5,500 Palestinians were killed, most of them civilians, and approximately 1,100 Israelis were killed, most of them civilians, as a result of the ongoing Israeli occupation and the attempt by Hamas to claim that they are the only champions of Palestinian nationalism. The PLO has made their compromise with Israel. They have sold out, according to the Hamas narrative, any aspiration of recapturing all of Palestine, and this bloody conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians sort of sinks to a deeper level of mayhem and chaos and violence and bloodshed. According to US political science professor Jeremy Pressman, popular Palestinian discontent that eventually grew out of the Oslo peace process because it wasn't producing the gains that it claimed to, allowed for Hamas to then insert itself and claim that, look, this great peace settlement and this great handshake that we in the United States celebrated between Yasser Arafat and Rabin in September 1993 wasn't producing the gains that it claimed it would. And Hamas says, see, I told you so. This is what happens when you compromise. This is what happens when you sell out. This is what happens when you don't resist. In January 2004, Hamas leader Sheikh Ahmed Yassin said that the group would end armed resistance against Israel in exchange for a state on the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, and restoring Palestinian historic rights related to the 1948 Exodus. You also begin to see statements that start to echo an attempt by Hamas to try and negotiate what they call a long-term ceasefire, a hudna in Arabic, for at least 10 years in exchange for some sort of quasi-state on the 1967 borders. There's all these statements by various leading Hamas officials in the West Bank that quote, just to give you one quote from one leading Hamas figure, he said that it's difficult to liberate all of our land at this stage. We can accept a phased liberation and a long-term truce. The leading Hamas leaders, Rantisi, Yassin, many others are systematically targeted for assassination, and they are removed from the political equation, again, hoping that this will end the organization's clout and influence. But of course, that doesn't happen. You have this very important development in 2006, where you have these parliamentary elections in Palestine, where, surprise, surprise, Hamas wins the elections, convincingly defeating the Palestine Authority, the remnants of the PLO, in a very convincing way, running on a platform of fighting corruption, good government, efficient government, meeting the basic civil and humanitarian needs of the Palestinian population. And so they win that election in 2006. It's an election that everyone agrees is free and fair. But the international community, particularly led by the United States and Russia and the European Union and the United Nations, known as the Quartet Group on the Middle East, states that unless Hamas agrees to recognize Israel and to resist violence, there could be no engagement, economic aid, conversations with the new elected Palestinian parliament headed by Hamas, and they should be quarantined and boycotted. And there's a freeze on all international engagement and interaction with the Palestine parliament and the new prime minister, who is a Hamas member. There is quickly an emerging situation that continues to today, where the Gaza Strip is effectively under siege. The Israeli occupation that had been sort of partially rolled back during the Oslo Accords is reconstituted and reimposed. Most of Hamas's leaders are arrested, put in prison, or sent into exile. And there is an ongoing sort of set of deteriorating human rights and civil rights conditions that take place that last up until this moment. And I'll say more about that shortly. Now, what are the goals of Hamas? The goals of Hamas from its inception in 1989, the official position is that the liberation of Palestine from Zionist occupation and the establishment of an Islamic state is the goal of this organization. They do say that Jews, Muslims, and Christians can live together, but within and under the framework of Islamic political values and norms, no recognition to the existing state of Israel, as it is deemed by Hamas to be a colonial settler state that was created on the ruins of Palestinian society in 1948. But as you get into the year 2000 and beyond, as I hinted earlier, you do begin to see significant attempts by the leadership of Hamas to strike out and to present a more moderate face with respect to a political resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict. In 2006, Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, said that a Palestinian state could be formed within the 1967 lines. Hamas was willing to declare a truce that could last up to 20 years and stated that Hamas, however, if it did that, and if Israel agreed to those terms, it would still not recognize the, quote, usurper Zionist government and will continue to pursue the goals of Palestinian liberation. A few months later, Hamas released its official legislative program leading up to the elections that I just mentioned. The document clearly signaled that Hamas would refuse to recognize Israel as an existing state. There's a provision in that platform called recognition of Israel. The question of recognizing Israel, this document says, is not the jurisdiction of one faction, nor the government, but a decision for all of the Palestinian people. Sort of hinting that if all of the Palestinian people decided to recognize Israel in some form, well, that wouldn't be the preference of Hamas. They would be obliged to submit to the will of the Palestinian people. And the argument being if there was some sort of national referendum that was negotiated, and then that led to some negotiations with Israel over some settlement, that perhaps could be a way forward toward resolving this particular conflict. A few months later, after that declaration by Hamas, which some people interpreted to be a major shift in policy, University of Maryland's Jerome Siegel sent a letter to US President George Bush stating that there is an opportunity here to advance the peace process, to build a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders that could lead to a settlement of the conflict, stating that Hamas has effectively, not de jure, but de facto, recognized or opened a way toward recognizing the state of Israel. In April 2008, in a meeting between Hamas Hamas's political leader, Khalid Mishaal, and Jimmy Carter, an understanding was reached in which Hamas agreed that it would respect the creation of a Palestinian state in territory seized by Israel in the 1967 war, provided that this was ratified by the Palestinian people in a referendum. Hamas later publicly offered a longer-term truce with Israel if Israel agrees to return to its 1967 borders and grant the right of return to Palestinian refugees. In November 2008, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh restated that Hamas was willing to accept a Palestinian state in the 67 borders and offered, again, a longer-term truce on the condition that Israel recognized Palestinian national rights. 2009, UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon repeated Haniyeh's argument, calling for a two-state settlement based on the 67 borders. And there has been ongoing sort of similar statements in this direction from Hamas that clearly marks a shift from their previously held positions of no compromise, no negotiation, absolute Palestinian liberation of lands that they lost in the 1948 and 1967 wars. Now, we have to talk about this one aspect of Hamas that frequently comes up and is part of the debate on this organization. And you all know about this because it has become so centrally connected to this topic. And of course, I'm referring to the debate around the Hamas Charter, the famous or infamous Hamas Charter issued in 1988. It outlines the organization's positions on many items. It was the founding document of the organization. It identifies Hamas as a Muslim Brotherhood movement in Palestine. It declares its members to be Muslims who fear God, who raise the banner of armed struggle in the face of oppressors. The charter states that our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious and calls for the eventual creation of an Islamic state in Palestine. There are also these really horrific and horrendous parts of the Hamas Charter that are clearly anti-Semitic. If you read them, they will shock anyone who has sensitivity to questions of racism and discrimination and anti-Semitism. That's there in the Charter. And that raises the question, at least in the popular debate, is that we can't negotiate with this organization because it has this disgusting charter. They have to repudiate the charter. The charter is the obstacle. If I had a penny every time this topic was mentioned in the context of Israel-Palestine, I would be an incredibly rich person. So what's the current status of the charter? Hamas political leader Khalid Mishaal indicated to Professor Robert Pastor at the American University, who's a senior advisor at the Carter Center, that the charter, according to Khalid Mishaal, is, quote, a piece of history no longer relevant but cannot be changed for internal reasons, he said. Hamas does not use the charter, interestingly, on their website and prefers to use its 2006 election manifesto. Instead, Professor Pastor states that those who quote the charter, rather than the more recent conciliatory statements by Hamas, are simply using the charter to block a negotiated and peaceful resolution of this conflict. British diplomat and former British ambassador to the United Nations, Sir Jeremy Greenstock, stated in early 2009 that the Hamas Charter was drawn up by Hamas-linked imam some 20 years ago and has never been adopted since Hamas was elected to political office in 2006. Other people have commented on the Hamas Charter as a tract meant to mobilize support that should be amended and eventually discarded as part of any political program. All of this sort of raises questions about what to do about the Hamas Charter. And I'm reminded of a very similar, for those people who've been involved in this conflict perhaps as long as I have and know their history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, there was an almost identical debate that took place in the late 1980s with respect to the PLO Charter. And Arafat and the PLO repeatedly, for similar reasons, told that they had to repudiate their charter. It was an obstacle to peace. It didn't recognize Israel. It was a founding document that was considered to be deeply offensive. And eventually, Arafat and the PLO did repudiate their charter as a condition for being involved in the Oslo peace negotiations. But Hamas pointed to that event, saying, yes, Arafat repudiated the charter of the PLO, but what did they get in return? Not very much. So why should we be required as a condition for negotiation to repudiate our charter in exchange for what? What's the lessons of history? There's also another aspect of this whole question of the Hamas charter, and that is that there seems to be a double standard being applied here to the Palestinians in terms of repudiating founding documents that are an obstacle to peace, that are not applied to the Israeli side of the equation. So, for example, the American Jewish journalist and public intellectual Peter Beinart argues that American Jewish groups should also be critical of Benjamin Netanyahu's comments on a two-state solution, where he repudiated it at one point, and then when he was sort of exposed, claims that he sort of now supports a two-state solution. But he makes the point that let's remember that the Likud party in Israel also has a set of founding documents that, if you read them in their own words, they completely negate the possibility of a Palestinian state. If one compares the Hamas charter, which I agree is a very problematic and disgusting document from the prospects of peace and from the perspective of trying to negotiate a settlement, but there are also documents within Israel. For example, if you read the founding sort of charter or political document of the Likud Party of Israel, it claims that the land of Israel includes, quote, the Kingdom of Jordan. So how is that not a problem for moving the peace process forward? Not only is that a problem, but I think this argument that we hear now that Hamas can't be engaged with, negotiated, talked to, because they are an organization where you have vile documents, nasty people who engage in violence, and they simply can't be part of any peace process, ignores the fact today that Benjamin Netanyahu and his current cabinet contain also a lot of individuals who have nasty political agendas and have said very ugly things that are explicitly racist, if not borderline fascist. And so if we're going to hold the Palestinian side to a standard of good behavior and good conduct and insist that their documents be repudiated and that they dissociate themselves from people who have said ugly things with respect to the other side, then I think the same standard has to be applied to, in this case, the Israeli side as well. Of course, the situation of Hamas has gone from, I think, bad to worse as a result of the 3 recent wars in Gaza that you were all familiar with. Operation Cast Lead, 2008-2009, approximately 1,500 people killed, most of them Palestinian, approximately 300 children. That was followed in 2012 by Operation Pillar of Defense, about 158 people killed, again, most of them Palestinian civilians. And then last summer, Operation Protective Edge in 2014, this time 2,200 people killed, again, most of them Palestinians, approximately 500 Palestinian children. The recent UN report on Gaza says that by 2020, the Gaza Strip could be uninhabitable. In addition to 8 years of economic blockade, in the past 6 years, the United Nations has reported, Gaza has endured 3 military operations that have shattered its ability to export and produce for a domestic market, ravaged its already debilitated infrastructure, left no time for reconstruction and economic building, and accelerated the de-development of the occupied territories. That would make this region, the Gaza Strip, which is known as the most congested part of the planet. It's been described as the world's largest open-air prison because it is under siege by Israel and on the other side by the Egyptian government. There's about 1.8 million people who live there, and there are severe shortages of water, electricity, and of course, on top of that, these 3 wars, the most recent war, deeply affected the quality of life in the Gaza Strip. Approximately 500,000 people were displaced as a result of the last war. 20,000 approximately Palestinian homes, 148 schools, 15 hospitals, and 45 primary health care centers were destroyed. Just last month, the respective international crisis group produced a document on Gaza called Exit Gaza ? That sort of amplified these figures and sort of just drew our attention to the dire political and economic situation that's facing the Gaza Strip. And of course, this has had consequences for the functioning of Hamas. As bad as you may think that Hamas is, the situation now, as a result of the enveloping, deteriorating economic, political situation, and as a result of the ongoing siege, is that there are now an upsurge of much more extremist, Salafi, jihadist organizations affiliated with or sympathetic to Al-Qaeda and ISIS that now are gaining some support within the Gaza Strip. And that makes perfect sense from the perspective of how these radical Islamist organizations emerge. They emerge in collapsed and broken societies when people have no hope, no opportunity, and they insert themselves and say, we are the way forward, come and join us. So this is sort of a increasingly big part of the political equation in the Gaza Strip, where Hamas, compared to these organizations, is much more moderate, modern, and a sophisticated political organization than these radical ones that are often responsible for starting some of these rocket fires that then lead to a larger political confrontation with Israel. So that is part of the, I think, background to the question of Hamas. Let me just end with two observations that I think are important for you to think about in terms of this particular topic, this particular group, and how it fits in with the Israel-Palestine conflict writ large. Recently, about 6 or 7 months ago, I was watching Real Time with Bill Maher, and he was talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and there was a Palestinian journalist who was on the program, and he sort of asked this question that seems quite innocent, and he asked his Palestinian interlocutor, can you be gay in Gaza?
Can you what?
Can you be gay in Gaza?
Oh.
His assumption being, obviously, you can't, and so there must be something deeply wrong with Palestinians or with Gazans or with the people who live there. And while that question may seem particularly innocent and appropriate, I was deeply shocked by the question and deeply offended by it.
Sorry, who asked the question?
Bill Maher asked
Bill
the
Maher.
question. I thought it was a deeply offensive question for reasons that should be clear to anyone who is familiar with the subject matter. Number one, can you be gay in Gaza sort of presupposes that you can be gay here in the United States or in the southern states of this country with ease, or that the West has always been sort of so tolerant and so open-minded and so inclusive that, you know, there's something wrong with the rest of the world if they're not up to the standard that we claim to uphold for ourselves. But more importantly, the question of can you be gay in Gaza really, I think, ignores the much more fundamental question. Can you simply be a human being in Gaza with basic rights to the minimum caloric intake it needs to survive, not to mention basic political rights and rights to self-determination? Of course, that's completely, ignored the enveloping context of this particular conversation. So when you try and, I think, impose or compare the status and the quality of life of Western liberal democratic societies with other parts of the world that are not only in a different moment in terms of their own historical development, but in this case, are societies that are deeply broken as a result of occupation, war, mayhem, and devastation. I think that is simply a gross comparison to make. It's analytically distorting, it's offensive, it clouds rather than illuminates the subject matter. The last point that I want to make is with respect to the question of the peace process and how to move this conflict forward. And when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was in office, when she was the Secretary of State in the first term of President Obama's administration, she laid out 3 conditions that Hamas needed to meet in order for it to be recognized as a player and a participant in resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the 3 conditions that she laid out was, number 1, Hamas had to recognize the state of Israel. Number 2, it had to renounce violence. And number 3, it had to recognize and accept past political agreements that were negotiated between the 2 sides. Now, broadly speaking, I think those 3 conditions are perfectly reasonable and acceptable. I think if Hamas were to make those changes, it would certainly move the yardsticks forward in terms of this particular conflict. But I don't think we can or should demand of Hamas those 3 conditions unless we make equal and similar demands to the other side of the conflict. In other words, is Israel forced to recognize the existence of a Palestinian state within its internationally recognized borders? Or, if you want to be more accurate, has any Israeli government, Likud or Labor, ever recognized that the Palestinian people have the same national rights to self-determination and to a homeland within its internationally recognized borders that Israel claims for itself? Condition number 2, renouncing violence. I think Hamas would make a contribution to peace in the Middle East if it renounced violence. But I think the other side of the equation, that if you want to look at the body bags, is responsible for a much greater level of violence, should also be demanded to resist and roll back their use of violence. To demand it of one side and not the other does not advance, I think, a peace process. It actually advances a defeat process, and it perpetuates the status quo. And the third part with respect to recognizing past agreements, has Israel recognized past agreements with respect to the Oslo Accords, with respect to its obligations under international law? So it seems pretty sort of accessible and uncontroversial when I present it to you in these ways. Demand the same standards and respect from both sides. But of course, if I were to make these arguments outside of this room in Washington, D.C., I would be branded a terrorist and an idiot. And what are you even saying? And that, I think, is sort of the last point that I think you are all instinctively aware of, but it's worth reinforcing, that this topic in particular, and this conflict in particular, here in the United States takes place not on a level playing field. We are deeply involved in, embedded with, connected to the Israel-Palestine conflict, largely from the perspective of one of the participants. Our political leaders, our large parts of American civil society, large parts of our intellectual class, for many different reasons, approach this conflict from the perspective out of sympathy and support and solidarity with the Israeli narrative and view of how this conflict originated, emerged, and how it can be resolved. Thankfully, when you go outside of the United States, I come from Canada, so I have to say when you go outside of North America, and you go to Europe, and you go to large parts of the third world, the interpretation and the discussion and the acrimony and polarization is not as extreme. Most of Europe and most of the developing world and most of the non-aligned countries take a position on the Israel-Palestine conflict that is in keeping with what international law sort of suggests and demands of the participants to this conflict in terms of how to resolve it. Whatever the historical rights or wrongs of the past, a resolution of this conflict based on international law, which means the 1967 borders, which also includes, and it's very, it's sad that I have to keep saying this, but 1967 borders and international law also includes Israeli withdrawal from East Jerusalem. This argument that somehow because Israel occupies and it's so central to Israel that they can claim the entire city of Jerusalem regardless of what the Palestinians think or believe, I don't think is an argument that we should let pass as simply an accepted fact because Israel is the stronger party to the conflict. So that's what the, I think, rest of the world, I think, is broadly in agreement on, except here in the United States. But of course, the other side of this equation is that the United States still, for better or for worse, is the most powerful country in the international system. It has disproportionate amount of influence and say in terms of how things play out, particularly on this particular issue that is very difficult to discuss politically in an objective way here in this country. But I do have to sort of acknowledge that I've been involved in this conflict for the better part of my adult life. And I do have to say that there have been significant shifts and changes in how broadly most Americans, most of my students, react and think and respond to this particular question. I recall when I first got involved in the late 1980s, it was very difficult to have an objective conversation with people about this topic. Not only has American public opinion, North American public opinion shifted in a much more healthy way, but also, and this is an important, I think, achievement that has been registered, significant parts of the American Jewish community now also realizes that the status quo and the ongoing dispossession and humiliation of the Palestinians is a recipe for disaster, not only for Israel, but for the region and for US foreign policy. So I think that's I think it's significant shift in terms of how this conflict is playing itself out here in this country. And that gives us, I think, some grounds for optimism. But having said that, you know, if one wants to sort of cast a larger gaze on where the Middle East is today, it's imploding. And the attention of the world now is no longer on Israel-Palestine. It's in other parts of the world. It's on the Iran nuclear accords, it's on ISIS, it's on Syria, it's Iraq, it's on Yemen. Israel-Palestine seems like a story that belongs to ancient history. But I would argue that the roots of the Israel-Palestine conflict are deeply connected to the rise and the spread of Islamic fundamentalism in the region, that if you can solve Israel-Palestine, that will be a significant step forward in terms of reducing the appeal of Islamic militancy. It will obviously be good for Israelis and Palestinians, but it will also have larger positive ripple effects. It won't solve the other problems in the Middle East, but it would certainly be a step forward. I'll end on that and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
You want to handle the question?
Sure,
It's fine.
go ahead.
Yeah, you kind of touched on it at the very end, but I think clarification is important because when people talk about the Israeli or the Jewish point of view, it's almost always as this one monolithic thing, whereas the predominant view is actually the right-wing Israeli or right-wing Jewish view. That's the one that predominates. And there are other voices in Israel that are for two-state solutions. And I think it's important to get people to understand that in this country, that what's pro-Israel, there's no pro-Israel. There's a pro-right-wing Israel. I mean, there's different factions. So just saying it's pro-Israel isn't necessarily in line with what most people in Israel want.
Right. You're right. I mean, J Street, right, calls itself pro-Israel, pro-peace.
Right.
Right. And it has a position that is much closer to the international consensus than obviously the right wing of the Israeli constituency, both in this country and in Israel. With respect to internal Israeli politics, it's clear that right-wing Israeli opinion is on the ascendant. That's how Netanyahu was able to get elected. I think it's part of the reason why he adopts such a hawkish view, because he knows that's where the votes are. But I would argue that if there was a significant and serious shift in US policy toward the Israel-Palestine conflict, sending a clear message that no longer will the United States protect, block, subsidize, and support Israel's violations of international law, and there'd be a much more firmer attempt by an American government toward Israel, that would have effects in terms of internal Israeli politics. And that would create a much more different playing field where voices within Israel that are supportive of a two-state settlement based on international law would have, I think, a greater chance in terms of making an effective case. But as long as we in the United States treat Israel like a spoiled child, give it whatever it wants,
Defend it no matter what it does.
Defend it no matter what it is. Even when its prime minister comes to our country and our Congress and tries to interpret and tell us how we should conduct our foreign policy, and still the repercussions are effectively nil, then as long as that relationship continues, there's no incentive for any Israeli government to make any sort of compromises, because they know that they are still powerful and that they have a lot of influence that they can wield over the political process in this country. And so I think that's really actually where the real battle is. I think in this country, trying to push for a more just and fair U.S. foreign policy. But of course, that's the hope and the optimism. And all of us had that hope and optimism when President Obama was elected.
Do you think
He
this
is knowledgeable, he was smart, but of course, now that he's leaving office, he's basically, given up. And so
I
there's
was
no-
going to say, do you think there's any possibility, either from a Republican fiscal conservatism point of view or any other point of view, is there any way we could get, because my opinion is we cut off all aid to Israel and Palestinians. I think within a year there'd be some kind of peace agreement.
Well, I mean,
Because Israel would realize they couldn't survive.
No, the problem with that is that try and make that a serious political project in the context of U.S. politics. Try and get one congressman or woman to take that position. You wouldn't have a chance in hell. Because the other side is so... What's that?
Donald Trump could do it.
Well, have you heard what Donald Trump has been saying on the question of the Middle East, on the Israeli Palestine? There's no room for optimism there. You should take close attention. Yes.
You talked earlier in the hour about the way Hamas has grown and become sort of an integral part of the Palestinian political process.
Right.
And that it provides social welfare, it provides war machines, it provides all manner of things. Where does it get its financing?
Well, it gets financing from sympathetic states in the region, depending on who its biggest backer is. At one time it was Iran. At one time it was Qatar. Before then, there was sort of, look, there's a lot of money in the Middle East and the Arab world.
Of course it is.
There's a lot of private individuals who have money. And they have given it historically, in one way or the other, to the Palestinian national cause. Yasser Arafat was the recipient of a lot of that money. And the Palestinians have been able, under Hamas, have been able to sort of been the recipient of some of that aid, from some friendly governments, and also from private charities and individuals.
Now, is that the same kind of blank check aid that we're talking about here that America, the United States, is offering to Israel?
There's no such thing as a blank check. I mean, I think if when Iran gives money to Hamas, it also wants something in return. And it wants Hamas to, to the extent that it can, support Iran's position in the region. Same with Qatar, same with Saudi Arabia, etc. So it plays out in a different way. Of course, the context in which Hamas is living in, who its supporters are, how it can access the money and how it can spend it is radically different than it is in this country, right? Very different political, economic context and relationship with donors. But broadly speaking, no one gets a blank check. There's always something that is demanded in
Well,
return.
I maybe use that term too broadly.
I understand your point. Yeah.
But if somebody's giving Hamas money, keep fighting Israel.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't think, see, if that's the argument that the reason why Hamas is fighting Israel is because someone is financing, ignores the fact that Hamas claims to, and I think does, represent an expression of Palestinian nationalism. In this case, from a religious perspective, but it's still the goals of trying to roll back Israeli occupation. If they can, I'm sure they would want all of the lands that they claim that they were dispossessing of. And so you don't need someone to pay you money to do that. If the argument here is somehow we can just cut off the money, then Hamas won't be what it is today, and then we'll be advancing the peace process. No, Hamas has popularity and support not because they're getting money and they can, build health clinics. It's because they do, at least politically, in the eyes of some Palestinians, represent, in comparison to all the other options that are there, an organization that seems to have some integrity and independence and connects with Palestinian nationalist aspirations. That's, I think, the core of it. Yes, the money helps. The fact that the other alternative option, the so-called Palestine Authority, is really a cruel joke. It's not a serious organization. It's monumentally corrupt. In the same way that other Arab secular nationalist governments and monarchies in the Arab world are corrupt, really, which explains the Arab Spring, largely. So the alternative, there's not an effective alternative, which gives Hamas sort of a leg up. Yes?
How would you explain the relationship between Hamas and the suicide bombers and other bombers that people always hear about and always hear negative with Hamas and not?
Yeah, well, they encouraged the suicide bombers, they supported it, they financed it, they were the main sort of architects of the suicide bombings. But of course, it's important to realize that there's a context here. Now, the suicide bombings, I think, are war crimes. But it's not like as if Hamas woke up one day and said, look, we got nothing better else, so we're going to go bomb Israeli civilians. It's happening in the context of a conflict where there's a huge disparity in power between the one side, which is one of the most powerful armies in the world, against effectively, now it's not polite to say that in this country, but it's effectively, in comparison to the power that Israel has, a defensive population. Suicide bombings are the arsenal and the weapons of a weak. They don't have an air force. They don't have a modern military. They don't have a navy. It's a desperate attempt to try and of course, Hamas was encouraged in the beginning of these suicide bombings because Israeli society was deeply shaken. Wow, maybe we could increase, and if you look at the numbers and the kill ratio, the number of Israeli civilians was really rising. Of course, the Palestinians were dying in greater numbers, but there seemed to be some sort of parity of killing each other's civilians that seemed to encourage at least Hamas to pursue this type of activity. The other aspect that I think worked against Hamas was around the time of the 1990s, getting to 2000s, they were inspired by what was happening in the north of Israel with respect to Hezbollah and the Israeli occupation in southern Lebanon. Through armed struggle and support from other regional countries, Syria and Iran, Hezbollah was able to effectively expel Israel from southern Lebanon. And so that gave support and sustenance. Well, if they can do it, why can't we? But of course, there's significant battlefield and tactical and qualitative differences in terms of the status of that particular conflict in southern Lebanon and what Hamas is facing in the West Bank and Gaza. My own personal opinion is that if Hamas and if the PLO would have engaged in a policy and a project of nonviolent civil resistance along a Gandhian model that would try and mobilize global international public opinion, the Palestinians would be much further along in terms of getting a Palestinian state. They haven't pursued it. I don't think they ever will, given different historical, cultural, and sort of ideological trends in the region. But that was the argument in terms of the suicide bombing, that they are hitting us, we're going to hit them. And I think as objective observers, to focus only on one side to exclude the other and not realize the enveloping context is to, I think, really adopt a warped and biased position. If you're interested in peace and justice, if you're interested in human rights, then all human life that is lost should affect you, and you should work towards some sort of political arrangement that gives all people a decent shot at a future. So I think that largely is the background context, and that was the argument and the motives for launching those types of attacks. Yes.
It has been suggested that last year's bombing of Gaza by Israel was a reaction to the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas getting together and chatting. What is the relationship between Hamas and the PA now?
Well, I mean, they both sort of need each other for different reasons, but the relationship between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas is deeply acrimonious and conflict-ridden. And right now, relations are very deeply sour. I don't think they'll ever get together because they have different political agendas and programs. I don't think the Palestinian Authority is interested in giving or conceding power to Hamas because they want to be the leadership of the Palestinian national movement. I think they're also fundamentally more corrupt. I don't think they really represent anyone anymore, despite their claims. What we hear sometimes from some of their supporters here in the United States. That's not to say that Fatah or the historic PLO doesn't have a certain cultural and political resonance with Palestinians broadly. But I'm talking this particular leadership, Mahmoud Abbas and his cohorts, So there's deep conflict, and I think Israel was, fearing that if there was this, Palestinian unity government that seemed to be forming, that would make it much more difficult for Israel to advance its political agenda, its program toward the occupied territories. I think one of the biggest fears that Israel has always had would be what was that the Palestinians would form some sort of comprehensive, united, effective movement that would represent Palestinians in a democratic way, and then they could make that appeal to the international community. And then Israel would have to really sort of have a much more difficult time portraying their adversaries as just a group of terrorists and fundamentalists, as opposed to an organized and respected national liberation organization that was fighting for its basic rights. So I think Israel is deeply worried about Palestinian peace offensives, deeply worried about Palestinian unity, the old divide and conquer strategy. Now that doesn't ignore the fact that internal, both within Hamas and within Fatah, they have their own internal corrupt sort of agendas that contribute to the disunification of the Palestinian national government. So I think those are the things that are happening and explain, the question you were referring to. Yes.
Yeah, I want to ask you. I'm just kind of presenting this as a reporter, reporting facts, but to get your opinion on it. There are certain people that I've heard on various audio casts and so on that feel that Israel has a very undue influence on American political system in general. And listen to you speak. I've never heard anybody claim that the Palestinians have an undue political influence on the political system in the United States. So it seems to me that that really the nature of this conflict is in fact quite wide. And so when you're saying, well, Israel should be held to the same standard as the Palestinians. Well, this is happening worldwide, really. I mean,
What's happening worldwide?
well, for example, take the situation of Ukraine.
Right.
I hear negative comments all the time about Putin. It's immediately claimed that the Russians shot down the MH17.
Well, they did.
Yeah, well, no, we don't know that.
Sure. Well,
No,
the evidence all points in that direction. But anyways,
There's
go
no
ahead.
report. Well, I'll argue straight out on that. You're wrong as you're calling me wrong. There's no.
We can
evidence
debate Ukraine later.
Okay, there's
Your question is.
the evidence. So the point I'm saying is that the conflict seems to be very large, much larger than just this little region.
Well, first of all, it's accurate and factual to say that Israel and its supporters do have a lot of influence over the American political system, and the Palestinians and their supporters in this country do not. I mean, have you been in this country over the last 2 months and followed the Iran nuclear debate? So, and that's simply a reflection of the fact that if you look at studies on political lobbies, the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, is considered to be one of the most organized and effective lobby groups in this country. In fact, you look at the academic studies, the toss-up as to whether it's AIPAC or the NRA that have the most sophisticated lobby groups that can effectively have veto power over what our elected officials think, believe, and how they vote. And this, I think, highlights one of the deep problems. It speaks to a larger problem here of the crisis of our own democracy. And it also explains why Donald Trump actually is getting a hearing. Because when he says, I can't be bought, lobby groups, private interests don't affect me, I'm financing my own campaign, that has a resonance because people can see the influence that lobby groups have. So yes, they have a lot of influence because you're allowed to form a lobby group in this country, you're allowed to advance your own goals. There's nothing illegal that Israel and supporters are doing. Theoretically, the Palestinians could organize their own lobby group. I mean, certainly, at least if you go outside of the Palestinians, you look at the Arab world, there's a lot of money in the Arab world. But of course, the Arab political leadership is so monumentally corrupt and beyond sort of any redemption that there's no hope in hell that they will try and invest the money in trying to counter what AIPAC does. The theoretical possibility is there, but it's not going to happen in at least my lifetime. So yes, there is a larger resonance as well. Palestine-Israel is a global conversation. it's a problem that goes far beyond the American politics or the politics of control over this piece of land. It actually has deeper resonance throughout the developing world for reasons that would require a separate lecture for me to get into. So I'll just leave it there. Go ahead.
How do you feel about the reference, the folks that are escaping Syria and Iraq, obviously to try to protect their families? Why do you think we're referring to them as migrants rather than refugees? Has that occurred to you?
Yeah, it has actually.
Yeah.
Because migrants is not as emotionally appealing as refugees.
It makes them seem like they're invasive
Yeah.
rather than,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, I
in
think
other
it's,
places.
I know, it's a good question. I mean, you should ask CNN why they use the term migrants all the
Yeah.
time. They're refugees. And they're refugees in many ways that are, fleeing a horrific conflict. If you look at the statistics, they're overwhelmingly, the ones that have fled into Europe are overwhelmingly Syrian refugees. There's some Iraqi, some Ethiopian, some Eritreans, some Libyans, but overwhelmingly 50% plus are Syrian.
And it creates a bigotry. These are people intruding on other countries.
Right, and of course the question, not just in Europe, but also in this country, and this is part of Donald Trump's appeal, there is a deep anti-immigrant mood, not just in this country, but also in Europe, right? During tough economic times, people feel that we don't have the ability to host any more outsiders. And so politicians are campaigning on it. What's really actually impressive, I think, about particularly Germany and Austria, who's let in the most refugees, is despite their own right-wing anti-immigrant parties, they have gone way above and beyond what anyone expected in terms of welcoming refugees at a moment in time when they have their own hawkish internal right-wing anti-immigrant parties. And that just
still trying to overcome their Nazi image.
Well, I think that's, I think there's a connection. I think actually I traveled to Europe, not a lot, but quite a bit, and I find Germany actually to be one of the most, if not the most morally sensitive country in the European continent. And it's a byproduct of the Nazi experience.
Yeah,
they're deeply sensitive to human suffering and the moral obligations that go with good citizenship. And I think that's really at the root of it. You can see it. Now, not all Germans feel that way, but I think that's significant. And that, I think, explains Angela Merkel's position on the Syrian refugees. Yes?
Is there any hope for Gaza? What's happening that's positive in terms of rebuilding or?
No, there is no hope, at least that I can see. And I hate to say that to people, but the enveloping political context suggests that Gaza will continue to sink into despair, that there's no hope for solving the Israel-Palestine conflict in any significant way. I mean, there's many reasons, but one could point to in this country where I think if there was a more effective US policy toward Israel-Palestine, it could act as a catalyst to start things moving. But we didn't see that under President Obama, despite his attempts to do so. But as soon as he met resistance, he gave up. The next president, whoever that will be, I strongly would be suspicious or would think that they would have a more effective policy on this issue, simply because it's not a position that enhances your political career or that you can win easily. It's a difficult battle for any president to try and mobilize a constituency for peace. I mean, I think President Obama knows that, and I suspect when you read his memoirs, he's going to make that argument. So there is no hope for Gaza, at least that I can see. The region is deteriorating. Gaza is now sort of off the radar screen completely as other issues that have much more greater effect and connection with American national security interests elevate themselves. Syria, Iraq, Yemen, the Iran nuclear accord. So it's a disappointing statement to make, but I think we have to be as honest as we can. That doesn't mean that individual Americans and people who can't help the people of Gaza in terms of...
Do a short follow-up, just to give
Sure.
us some ammunition. If we talk to people who say, well, the Israeli government turned Gaza over to Hamas and, it was a disaster. Obviously, there were lots of problems with the way they did that. Can you just...
Well, first of all, Israel pulled out, it didn't turn over Gaza to, Hamas or the Palestinians. It withdrew to the borders of Gaza, placed that territory under siege, and Egypt, the corrupt military dictatorship of Egypt, maintains the other border, and it's effectively under siege. And so I would say this, if Gaza was such a wonderful example of withdrawing military forces and giving people the right to self-determination, would Israel want to be subjected to the same type of restrictions that the Gaza Strip is subjected to, if it's so noble and wonderful? Under international law, the Gaza Strip is still considered occupied territory because all of the borders, it's like you pulled out the prison guards and the warden from a prison, but you maintained the defense around the prison, and the people are left inside to organize their own affairs. So, I mean, that's one of the, obviously, propaganda talking points that you hear, but it's really morally incumbent, if you're interested in this issue, to be armed with the facts, to be armed with, you know, what's happening in Gaza, what the international law position is on this question, and to be able to answer back. Because if you're not, then your interlocutors are going to just make these, you know, ridiculous talking points that sound very appealing, because there is an element of truth. Yes, in 2005, Israel did pull out, but it didn't grant the Palestinians in Gaza self-determination. It simply reconstituted the siege in another form. Yes?
There is, I believe, a major variable that has been perhaps ignored intentionally, perhaps.
That is what?
A variable that is a religious variable that has been ignored by the people that are trying to bring this conflict, the end of the conflict. Why is this variable, this religious aspect of Israel belonging to the Jews, and therefore this is a land that God has given us, and it is our right to fight for it? It's not. It has not been discussed. It is only discussed in religious groups, perhaps in churches. But nowadays we don't hear of this.
I think the reason for that is if you look at the origins and founding of political Zionism, if you look at the leaders of the founding members of the State of Israel, and even the current leaders of the State of Israel, largely speaking, they are secularists. They're not religious people that are opening some, you know, sacred text and following that. They're interested in their own political ideological programs and their own personal careers. Now, there is a segment of Israeli society that does subscribe to what you talk to. They believe that they have an inherent right to this land because of what God allegedly has promised them. That is a part of the Israeli demographic and political constituency. And their numbers are increasing based on, you know, birth rates. But I think most of the main political parties in Israel, certainly Benjamin Netanyahu, and certainly I think most of the supporters of right-wing Israeli opinion in this country, among American Jews, don't subscribe to what you said. So now there is the American evangelical Christians.
That's what I'm talking about.
Who are of the perspective that you just articulated.
That's what I'm talking about.
So they are Americans, they are Christians, and they believe for reasons that I don't think we have the time to get into, that somehow the creation and the expansion of the State of Israel is in keeping with what Jesus Christ sort of wanted for humanity. So, but that's a uniquely American Christian Protestant sort of problem that is only a factor in the politics of this country.
But it's very powerful.
It's very powerful, yeah, in the Republican
Party. It has a lot
Party.
of money.
Yeah, it has a lot of money, influence, and it is part of the broader pro-Israel lobby. When we talk about the pro-Israel lobby, it's not just right-wing American Jews or liberal American Jews, it's also this constituency that, you know, for reasons that are very unique to this country, have a very loud voice and are obsessed with this topic. Yes?
You mentioned before regarding Hamas's suicide bombing campaign, and that ended around 2004, I think.
Approximately, yeah.
And then later, they're moving into sort of more into politics in 2006.
Right.
And many people have, obviously not everyone, so many people have claimed that the security fence or border or whatever it's called prevented that from going on, and others have said that's nonsense because a lot of Palestinians go to Israel all the time with minorities and so on. So was that in their own consideration that this campaign failed and that political?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think largely Israel figured out how to prevent these suicide bombers from coming into Israel from the occupied territories. A lot of them were coming in, you know, into Israel proper from Palestinian towns. And so the fence and tighter restrictions made that much more difficult for Hamas to send suicide bombers. I also think partly it was a change in strategy, realization that this is not going to produce the types of results that they hoped it would produce. So I think it's a combination of both. Which one was more effective? I'm not sure, but it's certainly, there's elements of both that explain why Hamas has not been able to pursue that strategy any longer.
And a follow-up.
Sure, quickly.
When you said versus the secular nationalist Islamists, what exactly, why did they fail so?
Well, I mean, because they're corrupt. They haven't been able to produce any of the claims that they were making, that we will, in the case of Palestine, liberate Palestine, provide the Palestinians with access to their homes. So 1993, you had the Oslo Peace Accords, right? The Oslo peace process. Arafat, comes back onto the scene. He's allowed to return to certain parts of the Palestinian territory. And, looking back on the Oslo Accords, what can Arafat and supporters claim was actually given or delivered to the Palestinians? The amount of settlements that exist in the occupied territories now has doubled since the Oslo Accords. Are the Palestinians better off now, or were they better off prior to the Oslo Accords? So what can secular Palestinian nationalists, or for that, take a step back, secular nationalists across the Arab world, what can they claim has been an effective accomplishment that they can sell? And of course, when Arafat comes back, he also leads a typically corrupt sort of administration that sort of, is rooted in nepotism and cronyism. And so, they don't have a lot to sort of, advertise in terms of their own legitimacy and their own
What
credentials.
about this frequent claim that Arafat supposedly walked away from a two-state solution? I've heard that so many times.
That's another part of the talking points that again, the Palestinians were given a chance to resolve this conflict because there's something allegedly within their DNA they can't make peace. That's the argument. If you actually look at what was offered and negotiated in the Camp David II Accords, it was a state that is equivalent to a piece of Swiss cheese, where there would be no contiguous Palestinian state. What was offered to Arafat was not something that he could legitimately go back to the Palestinians and try and sell. It was basically a peace plan that was advancing some sort of Palestinian state that was equivalent to an ethnic reservation or similar to a South African Bantustan, where they're disconnected, not a viable state in any sense of so that claim is one of the talking points that you hear. It really goes back to an argument that is sort of, I consider to be borderline racist for those people who remember this conflict. His former Israeli foreign minister, Abba Eban, once famously said that the Palestinians have never failed to miss an opportunity to make peace. There's he made this, I forget the exact phrase, but there's something inherent about the Palestinian Arab side that they can't seize the opportunity to make peace. As if there was ever been sort of a serious and viable offer by the other side.
So
that was the argument. Yeah. So if you go back and look at, there's a lot of good documentation on this, if you're interested in terms of exactly what happened at those negotiations at Camp David II, that explains the details of what was offered and what was rejected.
So it was essentially the same at Camp David.
Yeah, the Camp David II. Yeah, it was basically an offer that was not a viable option for resolving this conflict. Maybe take two more questions and then end it. One at the back and then one at the front here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to know what you think about the changing relationship between the West and Iran, and if that has the potential to shift the proper relations in the rest of the world.
I think the nuclear deal is a historic breakthrough. It's a turning point, largely because it removes from the international system, the politics of the Middle East, a potential flashpoint that could have led to another war. So it's largely a step in the right direction because it prevents another war from happening. But I think one has to be very cautious about this nuclear agreement leading to some sort of transformative relationship between the United States and Iran in the near future. That might happen somewhere down the road. And I think the biggest obstacle to a diplomatic resolution or normal diplomatic relations between Iran and the United States actually lies not in this country, but inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, relations with Iran here are very controversial, as we saw in these nuclear negotiations and the debate in Congress. It's controversial. Inside Iran, relations with the United States is an existential question of survival for the regime, because it's so rooted in an anti-American narrative. And to have any change in that would threaten the structure of power. So as long as, long story short, as long as the current supreme leader is alive, and as long as the structure of power is in place in Iran, there will be elements among the ruling elite, such as Rouhani and Zarif, who want diplomatic relations, but they don't have final say. So I think we have to wait much longer before we see anything like the restoration of relations between the United States and Cuba. That's somewhere down the road. Last question.
I read something a while ago, and I was kind of stunned by it, but you kind of touched on something about Gaza with the state that it's in now.
Yeah.
And, you know, we know they're out rebuilding, et cetera, but I want to read it. It says the administrative law, ILA, and I'm not real sure what that is. It's in Israel. Quietly passed by the Israeli Knesset in 2009 as the final stage of the 62-year process of displacement from their homeland. The legislation is expected to have a long-term disastrous impact on Palestinian lives and precludes the possibility of a negotiated resolution to the conflict, meaning the land. Netanyahu's, he's told many times, I mean, I suppose people have heard it since we know all the towns are separated, you know, by walls, et cetera, et cetera. And he says they can have their state. He's saying they can have their state, but it's like in '48 they just raise a flag and do something completely on their own.
Right.
And they're going to do this on their own too.
Right. You have to be careful when Netanyahu claims that he supports a Palestinian state.
Amen.
What's that?
Amen. I know.
When he claims that he supports a two-state settlement, I mean, the question you have to ask is, where are the borders of this state?
Yeah.
You can claim a sort of a city-state and make sort of Jericho some sort of state, but unless it's a viable state based on international law, then it's not really a state.
Well, my problem.
So I think that's the context in which you have to sort of look at this
I
this
think
topic.
you're right. It's just that nobody's challenging him or making him define what you just said,
Right.
how he's thinking.
Right.
I know it, but a lot of people don't, and they're assuming that.
That's the
he's
job.
making
That's the job
he's
of
not-
every citizen who lives in a free society and has a voice to vote, to organize, to mobilize, to make sure that your voice on this issue is heard in the corridors of political power, and that your elected representatives reflect the sentiment that you just expressed. Because you can't expect people like Netanyahu or people who have power to sort of all of a sudden one day and have this eureka moment and think that, you know, they're going to resolve this conflict. I believe that politics is a matter of political contestation, organization, mobilization, that forces concessions on the other side when they are confronted with a constituency that has political power and has a cause behind it that can, you know, advance a peace process.
Well, this is something that's not on the ballot, you know, and the one that is, for instance, might be the Iranian deal.
Right.
And we have yet, unless somebody knows, to find out Diana DeGette might vote, or Michael Bennett.
Yeah.
And
Well,
you
on
can't
what?
find out until the.
Well, Bennett voted for the Iran deal, so.
Pardon?
He supported it.
But we don't know about it yet, you know.
Yes.
No, we do. She did. How did she vote?
All of the Democrats in Colorado
Voted in
voted in favor of it.
Yes. So I haven't got a feedback on that, but,
Great, thanks for your attention.